The very first rule of tabletop game development is that the very first version of your draft rules is going to really suck. Now I'll pause for a moment while your ego recovers from that massive crotch kick. And now, let me talk a little bit about how you actually get a first draft of rules created. What you just saw there was the front page of this notebook here, and it's a very preliminary rough draft of a new tabletop miniatures game that I'm working on. Now, I had a bunch of ideas floating around in my head for mechanics of this game, and when it came to turning them into something that resembles a rule book, keyword resembles, because the first main guideline is don't worry about writing a super fancy, elegant rule book. You need something that's barely coherent. It's got to be good enough such that when you go to do a play test, you can reference back to it and be like, okay, that's what I meant. I know what I was trying to do. Because you're going to change a lot of things between what's on here and what eventually ends up in some sort of production fashion. Trust me, it's going to happen. If it doesn't, you're probably doing something wrong. Hence the whole joke about your first rule set is going to suck. Now, the second guideline to follow is I know tabletop gamers love to theory hammer everything, where they think they can sit down in their head, figure out all the problems there's going to be, and solve them all in their head. So when you get some sort of rule set written down right here, it's going to be perfect. Or whether maybe it's a scenario for a game, it's going to be perfect and there's going to be no flaws. Now, I won't say that's not true for some people. It may actually be the case, but for the vast majority of you guys out there, it is not the case. So I wouldn't worry about trying to get in arguments with people or the other game developers about what ideas to go with. Just write things down, put them in a coherent rule set. If you've got some possible alternative options for a given rule, just go ahead and make 2 sets of them and try them out in different play tests and see what happens. You're going to learn a lot more from play testing the game than you are debating rules with your friends or even with yourself. Yeah. So anyway, let's take this rough draft of rules here and run a quick play test. So first of all, guys, I gotta be honest with you. This is not the first time I've actually played this rule set. Last week, I was really sick. I got up at 3 in the morning and couldn't sleep. So what did I do? I came out here and play tested my new tabletop miniatures game because why not? It's weird, but it's what happened. This is the second time I've ran through these rule sets. Now, one thing I want to point out on the tabletop here is, of course, I've got Battletech miniatures. And this is obviously not a Battletech game. It's not even giant combat robots. There's a little idea of scale for you. The reason I'm using these particular figures is because my line of sight rules called for interaction with hex bases, and that's why I chose to use Battletech miniatures. Now, when it comes to play tests like this, early alpha things, I've got 3 main rules that you want to follow. First of all, make notes about everything. So write down any ideas, thoughts, problems, all that stuff that you have. You may think in your head that you're going to remember everything, but I assure you, you are not going to do so. I've got some notes written down here at the end of the rules. I also went in some of the other parts, crossed things off, marked them up, that kind of fun stuff. Now, rule number 2 comes in during an actual game. Try not to change the rules of a game during a play test. You want things to be relatively stable just to see how everything works out, and if you're constantly changing rules, you may not learn a whole lot because you won't really see how a game really feels. If you do run in a situation where a rule is egregiously bad and you have to change it, stop the playtest and start a new game. Now, third and final important rule here. As you notice, I was obviously running this game just by myself, trying things out. I don't have any other players here. And that may seem kind of odd, but when you're in the very early development of a game, I would not recommend showing it to anybody outside your development team, even if that is just you. You need to get to the point where A, you can actually explain how to play the game to people, and B, you have something that doesn't totally suck before you start showing to other people. Because one of the worst things you can do is show a crappy product to people at a convention or something. They're going to remember your game, remember it's a crappy product, and not going to want to play it or buy it or try it out when it's fully released, even if it's a totally different game because they had such a crappy experience at the start. So just keep that in mind before you start showing this game off to lots of people. You want it to be in a somewhat decently good state. All right, let's head back to the studio and do a little bit more post-analysis of what I learned from this playtest. So when it comes to taking notes that I mentioned about just a moment ago, make sure you write your notes down in a way you remember what they are. This one here says bonus reroll 2 dice. I think I know what that refers to in the rule set. It kind of deals with some terminology I was putting together for Kaladeshi 3rd edition. I was bringing that over into this game. But let's talk about some of the big picture changes I learned from my game. Now, obviously, I haven't talked a lot about what the game is. I'm doing that kind of intentional to keep things vague because I'm so early on in development, a lot of things could possibly change. But my first big note is I'm actually kind of happy with this rule set. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. There's definitely some problems I'll talk about here in a moment, but it's a good thing that it's not as terrible as it's going to be because I've actually kind of had this thing floating around in my head for 4 years or more, maybe more, I don't really remember. I know that kind of goes against the first guideline I talked about at the very beginning of this video, but that was more of I just hadn't decided when I was going to release this game or make it. It wasn't a case of me trying to figure out all the rules. It was I just wasn't ready to make the game yet. And now I kind of am. I want to try something a little bit different. In terms of some of the big issues with the game, one of the problems I ran into is making the game more dynamic. Players need a way to really try to force the end game or to defeat their opponents. It seemed to mostly end up to where you have the two sides kind of form a battle line, and there's a lot of random dice rolling going back and forth until one side kind of suffers a bad roll and they lose a character or something really bad happens, and then the game just kind of ends from there. So some thoughts on that for my game would be the use of grenades. So players have a different way to kind of force players to move around. Also, I might change up how the damage system works and how you can recover from some types of damage. That way, I'd want to be able to force players, not force players is a bad word, have players make it a hard decision between moving a character and for a turn and then losing a type of action to try to protect them, or be more aggressive somewhere else and risk losing that damaged character a little bit easier. And if you cause players to make decisions like that, they're going to intentionally move their characters around more, and it's going to open up more strategic options for the opponent to take advantage of to gain advantages during the course of the game. Also, I'm not really sure how the end game is going to work per se. Like, once one character on a side goes down, the other side just seems to roll them up and win that way. That's not really what I want. I would like to see a little bit more of a comeback mechanic. But right now, all the characters in the game are following a single generic profile. So it's not a super immediate concern, but just one more thing that I'm thinking about. And I'll probably go back and tweak some rules so that I can make both of those things hopefully work better. We'll run some more play tests, and then we'll come back at some point in a future episode to talk about what the next steps are for your tabletop game development. You know, there's one little thing I didn't mention about head things down there. Let me go ahead and grab one thing from the play test, and I'll be back in a moment. And that thing is right here. What I'm holding here is obviously it's from the Star Trek collectible card game from who knows when this was, probably 90s, back in the heyday of all that stuff. But if your game requires any sort of deck of cards, the best way to do it is to get a hold of a whole bunch of these old collectible cards. Yeah, I guess that's what you got to say, collectible cards. You can buy them really cheap, like $5 for a giant pack of like 100 or something. And then on the front side, around the actual card text, in the middle here, there's this little white patch. This is a computer label that I printed off the rules for the particular card that I need, and I just stuck the label on right there. They stick really well to these cards and then allows you to actually properly shuffle the deck. Whereas trying to do other methods of like tape or glue or things cause all sorts of problems. This is a fantastic way to create your own test card decks for really cheap amounts of money. All right, so hopefully some of my rambling thoughts here today give you some ideas about where to start with your own tabletop game. So go ahead, start getting your ideas down on paper, run some play tests, and in the not too distant future, we'll move on to the next step in whatever that happens to evolve for my game. So thank you guys all for watching. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and I'll see you guys all next time.